He has a pretty bad track record on the environment, but I have to say, in terms of climate impacts, Doug Ford may have had one of the biggest impacts on Canada's carbon emissions of any premier through just that decision to keep Pickering going for a little while longer. Again, that's 1% of Canada's emissions if we shut Pickering down.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. On this episode, I'm going to revisit an issue that I've spent a lot of time on because I think it's probably the most important issue of our time, and that's the transition of our entire economy from a fossil fuel basis to a low carbon basis. And as anyone who's followed my podcast knows, I believe that the safest and cheapest way to do this is through dispatchable, safe, clean, green nuclear energy. And to do this, we need to use all the tools at our disposal. We need to keep our existing assets, upgrade them if necessary, and we need to bring online a lot more. And we also need to tax the fossil fuels and remove them and replace them in a safe and efficient way. And to discuss this, you'll probably be happy to know that I'm bringing back a guest that I've chatted with before. And this guest is very active in the field of nuclear advocacy. And I think you'll enjoy this episode. I know I enjoyed chatting with him last time. If you do like it, please hit like on your podcast app. Please share it with your friends. And come chat with me at the Rational View discussion group on Facebook. I'd love to hear from you. Dr. Chris Keefer is an emergency physician, medical simulation educator, nuclear energy advocate, and a popular podcaster. He's president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy and the director of Doctors for Nuclear Energy. Plus, he's the host of the Decouple Podcast. He also has another special honor. He's the first repeat guest on The Rational View. Since our first interview, I've gotten to know Chris a lot better through Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and he constantly amazes me with his energy and focus on nuclear advocacy. Chris, welcome back to The Rational View.
Al, it's an honor to be the first returning guest. Thank you for having me back on.
So what have you been up to since our first interview almost a year ago?
Yeah, it's been that long. Well, I've been working away in the emergency department and got vaccinated, which feels absolutely fabulous. A little bit protected before our third wave hit us. Things have simmered down a bit in the ER, and been busy with the podcast, and more recently, really bringing this nuclear advocacy thing home and grounding it in my home context. I've always kind of had this joke that with climate change, there's a lot of talk about what can you do as an individual? What if I become a vegan? What if I ride my bike more often? What if I get an electric car? And I've always applied that triage ethic that I think we talked about in the first episode of,
Yes.
How can I marshal the limited resources I have to make the biggest difference? And I've always thought that saving a nuclear power plant probably has the largest carbon impact. And indeed, we've run the calculations on it. If we're able to save Pickering and refurbish it, I'll be able to keep 10 million tons of CO2 out of the air. So that's kind of what's been motivating me recently. And
wow, 10
got
million.
an exciting campaign to tell you about if you want to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely love to hear about your campaign. Do you want to tell me what it is? What are we doing?
Yeah, so Canadians for Nuclear Energy, we've throughout our history, we've been, we just actually were founded in December of 2019, right on the cusp there of the new year. We were busy. We put out a House of Commons petition, really bold pro-nuclear language, specifically saying nuclear energy is the most environmentally friendly form of energy generation, drawing attention to, the 76,000 Canadians that are employed in high-skilled, high-paying jobs across the country, the contribution of medical isotopes to the pandemic. We actually got it read on the floor of the House of Commons by Julie Zerowicz, one of local Liberal MP of mine. So we've done some kind of exciting things. But yeah, the most recent action that we've taken is a campaign called Tax the Gas. And this has to do with, what I feel is really a big scandal of our time, a big climate scandal of our time, which is that, even with Ontario's reluctant move towards carbon tax legislation, through our large emitters program, we will be exempting our only real carbon emitting form of energy generation on the grid, aka natural gas, will be exempting 90% of their emissions from actually being carbon taxed.
So let me get this straight. 90% of natural gas power is not going to be subject to the carbon tax through a program called the Big Emitters Program?
It's an emissions. I'm learning about some of the technical language here.
That does sound scandalous.
Yeah, it is. It really is. It's very interesting because, really this is the result of the Ontario government, rejecting the premise of a carbon tax. Those of your listeners who live in Ontario will probably remember the stickers, the decals that Doug Ford forced us to put on our gas pumps. Rejecting the carbon tax, but reluctantly, through a Supreme Court challenge, the federal mandate of imposing carbon taxes on provincial governments was accepted. The federal government actually is equally responsible because they've put in what's called a backstop, essentially. So certain guidelines to how aggressive the tax has to be, and so they've set this margin of 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour as the point at which any emissions above that will be taxed.
And what's Ontario's average emissions right now? Like the Ontario power grid, what do we typically emit?
It bounces around a little bit, but it's something around 45 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So Ontario is a world leader in terms of a clean energy grid. It was something that I did not know about prior to this advocacy, and really it's one of the reasons that I became so motivated to be engaged in this, is that we are a province with some hydro resources, but around the world, the successful decarbonizations of large economies has all been on the backbone of either hydro or hydro with nuclear. So learning that Ontario was a climate leader and that we had an example to share not only across the country but with the world was motivating. And we did a great thing in the early 2000s, which was to mandate that coal be removed from the grid. We were able to do that because we had some CANDU units that were mothballed, and we were able to bring them back online, and forever kick coal off the grid. And so now our only sort of source of emissions is gas generation. And a carbon tax is supposed to be this market-friendly way to incentivize good behavior. And, if you're only taxing 10% of the emissions, our argument at Canadians for Nuclear Energy is that this is not enough.
Wow. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So Ontario's average emissions is on the order of 40 grams per kilowatt hour of CO2.
Yeah.
And this tax doesn't kick in until you get to 300 grams. So, almost 10 times our average before you're going to see any carbon tax on the big emitters on the power system.
Exactly.
So you and me are going to be paying carbon tax on our gasoline, but the big utilities that are burning fossil fuels to make electricity aren't taxed until they're only 10% of their emissions are going to be taxed?
Exactly. And this is all occurring in the context of Ontarians losing one of our key pieces of low carbon infrastructure, which is the Pickering nuclear generating station. And again, for someone who didn't know a lot about nuclear up until a couple of years ago, Ontario has the largest operating nuclear plant in the world right now up at Bruce Power, and we have two other very large stations putting enormous amounts of carbon-free electricity onto the grid. We, in the early 2000s, we had to make a decision. And one of those was to refurbish Pickering, to swap out old components and get the reactors operating. And they had a projected lifespan into the 2060s with refurbishment. But for a variety of reasons, we chose instead to embark on something called the Green Energy Act, which was really an effort to try and replicate the German Energiewende, the energy turnaround, and focused on basically incentivizing private investors to build renewables with, very, very lucrative locked-in 20-year contracts that have really, contributed to, very, very high electricity prices here in Ontario, which of course are a regressive economic factor in terms of the poor people in this province.
So basically, we have an energy crisis scheduled for 2024. The Pickering nuclear reactor is scheduled to be shut down in 2024, and Pickering has what? Can you give us a background on Pickering's capacity? What is it? Just to set the stage for this change.
Sure. So it's really interesting. Pickering was built in the first section of it. So there's two big sides to it. There's 8 reactors there, 6 of which are currently operational. It was built instead of a 4 gigawatt coal plant. And it's just astounding to think about that. Like if a 4 gigawatt coal plant had been built just on the outskirts of the Greater Toronto area, the amount of pollution it would have created, the amount of lives that would have been cut down prematurely, as a physician, the toll in terms of respiratory conditions, cardiovascular, it's horrific to think about. So, instead of doing that, we built a very large nuclear station called Pickering. And yeah, so it delivers 3,100 megawatts. So, that's a lot of power. That's something like, I believe about 20% of Ontario's overall energy production at any given time. Because it's situated so close to Toronto, that power is a huge chunk of what powers the city. And in terms of our sort of baseload needs in the city, Pickering covers it. And it does it on an incredibly small land footprint of something a bit bigger than a large Costco or shopping mall.
Okay, but when was Pickering brought into service? Isn't it getting pretty old, a little long in the tooth? Isn't it dangerous having that next to Toronto?
Yeah, so there was two sides to this. There's the A side, which was built in the 70s, and the B side, most of which came along in the 80s. And so Canada reactors are designed with it's called a midlife refurbishment in mind, right? So that's when you swap out the critical components so that you can ensure a safe operation for another 30 or 40 years. And that's indeed what's happening now at Darlington and Bruce. So it's not controversial. This is not in any way untoward. This is something that's expected. It's refurbs have been finished now. On the A side of Pickering, so those older units, a lot of people are saying, hey, these are 50-year-old reactors. Well, no, the A side was built in the 70s, but it was refurbished in the late 90s. And so they have another lease on life of 30 years. The B side has not yet been refurbished, but it has another 30 to 40 years in it if we refurbish those 4 units. And Point Lepreau in New Brunswick, that plant has been refurbished. There's plants around the world that have been refurbished. So we know we can do this. And we have, really, really precious infrastructure. When you actually start looking at the challenges of decarbonization, and you realize what we're up against, just to electrify transportation in Ontario, we're going to require something like 2 times the output of Bruce Power, which is the largest nuclear generating station in the world. We're going to need about 14 to 15 gigawatts of electricity to do that. And we need that electricity to be reliable. We need to be performing at nighttime when people are charging their vehicles. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And we really need to think about our nuclear plants as, key pieces of infrastructure, as clean energy cathedrals, as they've been called by some of my colleagues in the U.S.
Indeed. Now, I'm agreeing with you, but I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because obviously there are a lot of people that think that we shouldn't refurbish Pickering. What happens... why is it being shut down? For example, why is it not being refurbished? Is there something particular about Pickering? It's very old. Maybe it's more difficult to refurbish than these other reactors that have been successfully refurbished.
So Yeah, I mean, there was an application put into the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. It was approved. There was an environmental assessment done as well. So the wheels were in motion for refurbishment. It was really a political decision. And
When
as I
was this
said,
decision made?
this was in the late two. It's almost hard talking about that first decade of the 2000s, but the application was put in the first decade of the 2000s. And the decision not to go ahead was actually, I believe, just in 2019, the final decision not to do a refurb. In the meantime, like I said, we spent tens of billions of dollars on these lucrative wind and solar contracts, which, unfortunately, if you add wind and solar to an ultra low carbon grid, it's not cost effective whatsoever in terms of bringing down emissions, and particularly when you're adding on sources like wind that produce, dramatically out of time with demand. So those investments really paid off very, very little in terms of carbon intensity, and we chose to invest in that direction rather than in a refurbishment of Pickering. Yes, it is a smaller plant with smaller units in it. It's going to be trickier to refurbish than some of the larger plants, so there's an economic argument there. But in terms of what we know how to do well here in Canada, we know can do intimately, right? We've done a number of refurbishments. We know how to do that well. Through studying nuclear throughout the world, and particularly in the West in the last 20 years, where a lot of projects have gone overpriced and over time. We need to stick with what I think are the safest bets, the things we're most equipped to deal with, the supply chains that we have in place, the workforce that is experienced. And those folks are, in terms of what's actively happening in the Canadian nuclear industry, there's talk about SMRs and things like that coming down the road, but we know how to refurbish. Our supply chains are there. And so for me, a refurbishment of Pickering represents the lowest risk opportunity for Canadians to preserve this vital piece of infrastructure. Just one cool stat, if we let Pickering go offline, replace it with gas, 10 million tons of CO2 are added to our emissions. That's going to increase Canada's overall emissions by 1% for the whole country. We're supposed to get 30% lower than 2005 emissions according to our Paris Agreement. So this is a big move in the wrong direction. This is again, a vital piece of infrastructure that's, again, absolutely vital to meeting our Paris commitments.
But our wind resources are being underutilized. What if, we shut down Pickering and renewables will take up the slack? Is that something that might happen?
So we have a wind fleet in Ontario that's, close to 5,000 megawatts. That sounds great. It's, got a capacity that's larger than Pickering's. The thing is, Pickering is online producing power at least 90% of the time. In Darlington, a neighboring plant, one of their reactors set the world record for the longest run of a thermal plant. Now, that wind capacity, unfortunately, it is very erratic. Some days it performs and you'll get almost all of it producing at once. But when we critically need it during heat waves, you might notice when it gets really hot and muggy here in Ontario, the wind is still. You wish there was a gust of breeze just to blow some of that sweat off you. But wind just doesn't show up, right? Or in the winter, in our deep cold spells, it's often quite still. So it's not a valuable resource for us in that regard. And so in no way can make up for the loss of Pickering. It's just you can't swap out an apple for an orange here. Okay,
well, how about another option? I've heard Ontario Clean Air Alliance talking about Quebec Hydro. Maybe if we run a new line to Quebec, we'll just use Quebec Hydro to fill in, and that's a very green, clean energy source. Ontario has a lot of hydro. Quebec has the most hydro of anywhere in the world, I think. Why don't we use their hydro?
So it's an interesting question. Ontario does have a decent amount of hydro. It is what we call run of the river. So it's not the kind of hydro that we can use to, firm renewables or really, help meet peaks in demand. But it's there. It's a valuable resource. It's very low carbon. You're right. Quebec has an enormous hydro capacity and they have a surplus and they're very interested in selling it. Currently, they sell it mostly to our neighbors in the United States, into New England, where it's used to displace coal and gas generation. That's an amazing use for, ultra low carbon hydro to displace gas and coal. What's not a great use for it is to ship it into Ontario. Presumably, then you're not going to be displacing that coal and gas from upstate New York. and using that hydro to replace ultra low emissions nuclear. It doesn't make sense. Carbon emissions, air pollution, they don't respect national boundaries. And then in addition to that, we're talking about an enormous amount of infrastructure that would need to get built. I'm not sure if you know any NIMBY people, but transmission lines are one of the things that's very strongly opposed by people going through their backyard. It would be a really, really big investment. I'm not sure if you've seen how far James Bay is from Toronto, for instance. So it's a long, long ways.
I've actually seen some reports saying that it's cheaper to keep Pickering running than it is to build new transmission for Quebec Hydro.
Well, I mean, it's not just, to be fair, it's not just about keeping it running. Like we have, actually Doug Ford did extend the life of Pickering for about 4 to 5 years, which is, a very important decision. He has a pretty bad track record on the environment in terms of things like the green belt and being very, pro-development at the expense of protected areas. But I have to say, in terms of climate impacts, Doug Ford may have had one of the biggest impacts on Canada's carbon emissions of any premier through just that decision to keep Pickering going for a little while longer. Again, that's 1% of Canada's emissions if we shut Pickering down. But just to continue on with this hydro from Quebec thing, because it's a very, potentially an enticing option. It seems to kind of intrinsically make some sense. We've talked about how, that power is already doing great work displacing coal and gas. Okay, so we want to continue that. CO2 emissions don't respect national boundaries. But the other part is that, Hydro-Quebec are willing to sell us a certain amount of energy. Let's say it's, 10 terawatt hours over a year. And that sounds great, but they're not saying that we're going to give you the exact power you need at the moment that you need it. And in fact, because Quebec heats with electricity, they peak their demand in the winter on cold, cold days. And every year, Ontario is actually exporting power to Quebec to help them through that crunch. So, we have the incredible luxury that when we experience a blackout, it's typically because a tree fell on a power line across the road. Some folks from the utility come and chop it down and get things up again in a few hours. We don't really have much experience with, critical blackouts. And so we have to be very careful about, building a reliable power system that we all depend on for, things like medical care. My hospital recently, the power lines were cut by a road service, and we were running on a diesel backup generator for 3 days. It's hair raising when you think about critical infrastructure. So, the hydro option from Quebec is it's not a realistic option, and it just makes zero sense. We need to build a lot more low carbon infrastructure, not build thousands of kilometers of transmission lines. To reroute low carbon hydro from upstate New York to Ontario.
So taking Quebec Hydro is bad for the environment because right now it's actually displacing coal and natural gas in the U.S. That's a good counter argument that I hadn't thought about that. So, I mean, this sort of thing has happened before. I think New York's shut down their Indian Point nuclear reactor under similar circumstances and for similar reasons. They're afraid of having, their anti-nuclear groups were worried about having this nuclear thing close to a large population center, effectively. What's the risk of having a nuclear facility close to a population center? It seems scary to have the risk of this somehow melting down and contaminating these cities. Is that a real risk, or is it fear mongering?
I mean, to be clear, Pickering is different than Indian Point. Indian Point did not require any refurbishment. It was shut down for exactly what you're describing, this fear mongering. But leaving that aside, Pickering is built near a large population center. I live here. My son lives here. My family lives here. When I used to drive up to my parents' cottage, I used to hold my breath when I drove past the Pickering facility because I was so scared of what could happen with it. It's quite ironic because it's actually what delivered the clean air that we now enjoy after the coal phase out. But in any case, Pickering is built with a vast number of backup systems. They actually have this vacuum building. So in the event of any radiologic release, any of those gases go into this vacuum building, this reinforced concrete building, where they're condensed out. So you can't have the kind of things like happened at Fukushima. And first off, there's not big fault lines and tsunami risks and things like that. But the CANDU design in and of itself, as well, is a very, very safe design. Throughout the course of CANDU history, there have been several small incidents with a single pressure tube breaking. The plants have handled that very well. There's not been any major release of anything to the public. So I think.
Now wait a minute. Just before you go on, these pressure tubes that I've heard about have broken in the past and nothing's been released. I thought these were like the most dangerous thing ever, and they're cracking and they're going to break, and we're all worried about this. And you're telling me they've already broken and no one was injured.
Yeah. I mean, so this is the other thing, right? When you hear about, well, this is an old technology, this is an old reactor. I mean, this is like a high performance car that you're constantly swapping new stuff in and out of, and you're improving the alloys and things on the tubes and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it's very different to have a tube crack than to have a core meltdown. It's I don't want to get too far into the details. I'm not a nuclear engineer,
Sure.
But suffice it to say, there's a lot of heavy water circulating around there. There's a lot of thermal mass to absorb heat from something like that. And to date, again, there have been a couple of pressure tube failures, and that has not resulted in any kind of a release. There's, again, a number of automatic backup systems like magnetic control rods, which will drop in, an element that's used to kill nuclear reactions that's ready to go. So there's kind of double redundancy in this vacuum building. Personally, I'm not worried about it whatsoever. I'm far more worried about the implications of dirty air, right? And, I was a child in Toronto in the early 2000s. I remember, Toronto used to be called the Big Smoke, right? The other day with the wildfires in Northern Ontario, there was some of that smoke blowing in, and it was a real flashback to that time, when you could barely make out the CN Tower or the office towers downtown. We have reports from the Ontario Medical Association that are estimating that because of the coal phase-out improvements in air quality during that time, we save something like 1,000 lives a year from air pollution, and tens of thousands of ER visits and hospitalizations. So, it is tricky because people have been raised to have a really mortal fear of radiation and anything nuclear, while we don't pay any attention to air pollution, which takes a massive toll on us. And that's what we're going to see happen here when Pickering closes, is almost its entire output is going to be replaced by natural gas, which is cleaner burning than coal, but nevertheless results in significant smog pollution.
It's a huge double standard. If you look at the research on health effects of burning fossil fuels and particulate matter in the air and all of these things, just the direct pollution-related deaths are clearly far and away more dangerous than any of the radiation that's released from nuclear plants, even in the worst accidents.
Yeah. A useful thing to remember is that outside of Ukraine, outside of Chernobyl, there's not been a single death from a radiation release from a civilian nuclear plant. Fukushima has not resulted in a single radiation-induced death. 3 Mile Island, neither, right? So, yes, there's this really key term, hazard versus a risk. Any form of highly dense energy poses a hazard. Natural gas pipelines blow up. Coal plants pollute the air. Those are hazards and risks. Nuclear has a hazard associated with it, but it's been exceptionally well managed. And we have to think about things not in terms of absolute risk, but relative risk. And nuclear, it's got a proven track record, and its impacts are unambiguously positive for public health as a result of displacing air polluting fossil fuels.
Indeed. There's a figure I've seen looking at, plotting the PM 2.5, which is like the 2.5 micron particle concentration from burning fossil fuels. And you can map it, and all cities are measuring this as a pollutant, and they have a daily update. And basically, if you measure any of this, you're killing more people than radiation in Chernobyl or Fukushima together. if you measure any of this stuff, and all cities are reporting on this, if we had a level playing field in terms of fear mongering, all of these cities would be evacuated as soon as you measure any of this. You would evacuate the city.
Yeah.
Because there's a known health risk that kills people.
Yeah. For sure.
The double standard is staggering.
It's a tough uphill battle, and I was a radiophobe. Like I've been there both because of my childhood, because of being the son of parents that fought against nuclear weapons testing, and as a physician, where we are very much a part of that linear no threshold hypothesis worldview, where we're trying to minimize radiation doses as much as possible because of a real exaggerated fear of what we might do with our medical diagnostics. But in the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to, like you, through our podcast, to interview some real world experts, and it's really changed my point of view. So I'm not trying to poo-poo and say that there's no hazards and no risks involved with nuclear power, but in terms of the relative risks, particularly, concretely with air pollution, but particularly in the context of runaway climate change, this is turning into a crisis, or turning into an emergency. It's a bit in slow motion, but we had 500 deaths from heat stress in BC this year, for God's sake. So we all need to do our part. We all need to pull, and we need to manage hazards and risks and apply those to the challenges that we face. And so for me, the calculus is 100% for doing everything we can to preserve this critical clean energy infrastructure.
The next thing that opponents are going to bring up is the cost. Nuclear is seen as the most expensive option. Now, I've looked at this, and I'm not certain that I agree with that. In fact, I'm pretty certain I don't agree with that. How much is it going to cost if we decide, can Ontario afford to refurbish Pickering? How much does it cost to fix this?
Now that is a very good question, because increased energy and electricity prices are very regressive, right? A rich and a poor household tend to spend about the same amount on energy. Because the rich household might be a bigger house, but they've got more efficient appliances, better insulation, etc. But a rich person might spend 1% of their disposable income on electricity, and a poor household is going to spend 10%. So it's no laughing matter, the choices that we make and the investments that we make. So first, I really want to address the seriousness of that. And already Ontario has some of the highest electricity prices in Canada. And our government actually devotes in the order of $6 billion a year to subsidize the ratepayer. It is, I think, the 5th biggest budget item in the provincial government. It's ahead of long-term care, for God's sakes, right? So this is a major expenditure. So cost is very important. I was mentioning before the lucrative contracts for wind and solar projects that Ontario signed and that we're stuck with, 20-year contracts, promising, prices that are 2, 3, 4, 5 times more than the market clearing price for electricity. So those have been a major stressor. But yes, nuclear is, it has a cost associated with it. It's a major infrastructure project. And I think, people being skeptical of nuclear in the West in particular have every right to be. We know nuclear can be done cheaply, and it is actually the fastest way to add low carbon power to a grid. We've seen that in France and Sweden, and Korea, Japan, China now. These are countries with a bit of a different context, though. Countries that did this either before we sort of eviscerated the idea of government being involved in large infrastructure and funding it and coordinating it. In the case of France and Sweden, these are different times. And we've seen, in the UK and in the US, nuclear projects have gone tragically over cost and over budget. So that's something that we as nuclear advocates really need to be aware of. That's again why I'm saying that refurbishment, I think, is our safest option. We have to be a bit humble and a bit conservative in our aspirations. As an industry in Canada, what we have expertise in at this point is in refurbishment of CANDUs. There are plans to build new nuclear. I absolutely support that. But I think that, the plans are to build small modular reactors, which will have 1/10 the output of Pickering. So it's a good addition to Pickering, but we need to keep Pickering around because, the amount of gas that we're going to be burning as a result of this, is going to be significant. If it were taxed for every ton of CO2 it put out, we estimate that in 18 years it would pay for the refurbishment of Pickering. So, our estimated cost, looking at Darlington and Bruce, is about $8.6 billion for Pickering with a B. It's a lot of money. It's no laughing matter. But
that is significant.
in terms of providing another 30 or 40 years of ultra reliable, always on, 4 or 5 gram CO2 per kilowatt hour electricity, we think it's worth it, and it's an important investment to make.
To put that into perspective, so that's 8.6 billion for 3,100 megawatts of capacity, and for 30 or 40 years. The wind in Ontario is something like...
It's a little more complicated than that, because there's this A side and B side issue, right? So the A units have another 10, 15 years in them, right? If we shut Pickering down now, we're going to shut those units down that still have another 10 or 15 years in them, a full 1,000 megawatts, because it's too costly to operate just that one part of the plant. So if we do shut the plant down in 2024, that A side is not going to run. We're going to lose 1,000 megawatts. It's perfectly good. Could go another 10 or 15 years. We're talking about just refurbishing the B side. So that's 2,000 megawatts. So it's about $4 billion per gigawatt.
Okay, that's good to know. And so contrasting that with, say, the wind fleet, we have something like 5,400 megawatts, I think, of capacity, nameplate capacity, but with a availability of about 33%, something like that.
That's generous. Yeah. So that fleet, in terms of the Green Energy Act, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we have spent tens of billions of dollars on the Green Energy Act, on that wind and solar build out. So we made a choice, like I said, in the early 2000s, which direction to go. We decided to go with this German example. It's debatable. I mean, in Germany, this huge investment in wind and solar has lowered emissions. Not significantly, but it has lowered it. And that's because it's in the context of a coal-powered grid. There's a lot of coal on the grid. If you add some low-carbon sources, even if all they're doing is just sparing some burning of coal, you drive emissions down. But when you added all that wind and solar to a grid that was already very low carbon, as the coal phase was completed with nuclear energy, it didn't have that benefit. And, you're saying it operates 30% of the time. That's true. But that 30% it operates at 30% of its capacity, but it's delivering energy when we don't need it. So we're curtailing a huge amount of it, but we're paying for every cent that is produced in many of these contracts. So yes, we've spent tens of billions on wind and solar. They haven't delivered for us, and we should have spent $8.6 billion on refurbishing Pickering. These are big numbers. They're scary, I know, but
I was gobsmacked when I saw the amount we pay for solar and wind. Like, I saw the Ontario Energy Board's report, and it's like solar is 49 cents per kilowatt hour, wind is like 14 or 15 cents per kilowatt hour, and then you see nuclear at 8 cents and hydro at 6 cents. And I was like, people keep telling me that nuclear is so expensive, but if you can go to the Ontario Energy Board and see how much we're paying, and we're paying twice as much for wind as we are for reliable nuclear. And it doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why are we doing this?
There's a great quote, that says that, wind and solar are a very cheap way to make expensive electricity, and nuclear is an expensive way to make cheap electricity. And that's because, leaving aside all the contracts and everything, integrating unreliable intermittent energy onto a modern grid is very costly. And those costs are not paid by the investors, starting up the wind and solar firms generally. Those are socialized onto the ratepayer in a regressive way. And so, when you look at feed-in tariffs around the world, I had Edgardo Sepulveda, he's a regulatory economist on my program, and we were looking at a study which showed that, I think it was in 25 of 26 jurisdictions, the result of feed-in tariffs to incent the use of wind and solar had resulted in regressive prices. It's essentially, the poor, rich people were incentivized; they got extra money, loans, higher rates to put wind and solar, particularly solar panels, on their roofs, and poor people fitted the bill, and it had a regressive economic impact. So, there's a lot to this story in terms of affordability and cost. Big numbers indeed, but again, if we're serious about decarbonization, we need to add something like 14 or 15 gigawatts of capacity to our grid to electrify transportation in this province.
Yeah, there was a recent announcement that they're not going to be selling internal combustion engines beyond, what was it, 2030 or something like that? Is that,
yeah?
Do you remember
2030,
that? 2035?
Yeah, and it's all this charade.
How are they going to power that? That's electricity, right? That's more electricity.
Absolutely. So, I mean, politicians, it's a cheap way to get votes to make these commitments and promises, but to actually make the difficult decisions and decide on the investments and to have the bold vision to get those done and choose the right technologies, they're missing in action. So, Ontario does have, we're not short on generation on our grid. We haven't got to this yet, but we have an enormous amount of gas-fired infrastructure lying around that sits very idle, operating less than 10% of the year, which is a very good thing. And, but when we do shut down Pickering, those capacity factors, the amount of time that gas is online are going to jump to something like 30 or 40% of the time. They're going to be providing base load, right? Not just the peaking that they do now, but base load power. And that's going to eliminate, we've estimated that's going to eliminate 50% of the emissions reduction that we achieved from the coal phase out. So this is a huge step backwards.
Now we're going to lose 50% of the emissions reduction from the coal phase out if Pickering is shut down.
And replaced
due to burning of natural gas.
Yeah, which the independent electricity systems operator is saying that we will.
Now, does that include the additional greenhouse gas footprint of the methane leaks from the fracking gas and delivery?
No, it does not. And the carbon tax itself, in terms of looking at life cycle emissions, the tax is occurring at what's measured at the stack, not the overall life cycle, which would include things like that leak rate you're referring to, which is a major contributor to climate change because, methane released into the atmosphere, at least over a 20-year period, has something like 80 times the warming potential of CO2.
Yeah, if you look at it, I think the Environmental Defense Fund did a study of a bunch of gas delivery, mining and delivery systems and found something like on average 3% of the methane was leaked to the atmosphere. And if that's really the case, if it's that bad, then that makes natural gas effectively the same as coal in terms of its 100-year greenhouse footprint. And worse in a 20-year time span because methane, comes out of the atmosphere quicker than CO2.
There's
actually worse than coal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's conflicting studies on it, but certainly has the potential to be, for sure, if we're not careful with fugitive emissions, as they're called. Speaking of the gas, I mean, this is another really important side of this story. So most of the gas that will be burned in Ontario's gas plants is sourced in the U.S. and is fracked, right? It's, natural gas prices do bounce around, but with the fracking revolution, it's relatively cheap. We don't know what will happen over the next, 20, 30 years for the lifetime of these gas plants. If we applied a carbon tax just on the gas that will be burnt to replace Pickering, there would be $500 million a year in carbon tax revenue. Okay.
Wow.
So gas plants are interesting because, it takes about 30 or 40 workers to run a, 1 gigawatt gas plant. So they're almost workerless pieces of infrastructure. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So the fuel is the expense, building it is the expense, right? With nuclear, it's an entirely different story. The capital cost of building the plant is expensive. The fuel is dirt cheap. But you have some expense in terms of paying the workers, right? So Pickering actually employs about 3,000 people. And wow. It employs them in high-paying jobs that are, high-tech STEM jobs. It does an enormous amount to raise the standard of living of the community. So 7,600 full-time equivalent jobs will be lost when Pickering shuts down, according to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. So this is an enormous impact. Like when the GM plant in Oshawa, it's Canada's century-old auto manufacturing plant, was shut down. I think it employed somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 people. There was a national uproar. The premier was up in arms. We're not hearing a hoot about this loss of which will devastate the surrounding communities in terms of losing that number of good high-paying jobs. Because we invented the CANDU reactor here in Canada, our supply chain, we mine the uranium in Saskatchewan, we turn it into fuel pellets, mostly here in Ontario. This is a 95% made in Canada proposition. So yes, $8.6 billion is a lot of money, but that money stays in our communities. It pays people good jobs, who circulate that money in their economy. It provides intergenerational employment of the kind that we, long for in this kind of gig economy era. And it produces ultra low carbon electricity. So it's a win for the climate. It's a win for clean air. It's a win for a green recovery, for good jobs. It's a win for medicine in terms of the medical isotopes that are produced at these facilities, which enable modern healthcare. So it's not without cost, but I think if you set up your Excel spreadsheet, you're going to find that the benefits, this is the most beneficial investment that we can make.
I know the political situation in Germany is very odd as well. And now that they've been shutting down their nuclear, and now they're dependent on Russia for gas. As soon as you become dependent on another country for your energy, and this is a critical infrastructure for your country, and if the politics in that country should suddenly go wrong, you're basically a hostage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I mean a big frustration for me as a science-based climate activist who advocates for nuclear is that I feel like I'm spending most of my energy in a rearguard action against misguided environmental groups that are hell-bent on closing down nuclear plants, which goes against everything they're saying in terms of the urgency of a climate emergency. In New York, when Indian Point shut down, they lost in one morning more clean energy than their entire wind and solar fleet. Like, just imagine someone going around with a hammer and a cutting torch, cutting down every wind turbine and smashing every solar panel in the course of one morning. That's what happened when Indian Point was shut down.
Well, if they do that to Pickering, it'll be similar, won't it?
It will be, for sure.
Pickering puts down, twice the amount of energy in a year as our whole wind fleet?
I believe so. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yeah, it's basically always on resource, and wind, as you're mentioning, has a capacity factor of high 20%. But something that I think is very interesting is precisely what we're talking about in terms of that that rearguard action against misguided environmentalists. I have a hard time calling them environmentalists because the things that they advocate for are not climate friendly and really have not been friendly for the environment. So in Ontario, we have a group called the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, and hats off to them. They were very instrumental in terms of creating the political pressure on the successive provincial governments to ban the use of coal and electricity. They were part of what motivated several medical associations to come out in favor. They did a lot of political organizing. I have immense respect for them in that regard. Where the story gets a bit weird is this so-called Clean Air Alliance. Their plan for phasing out coal was to build gas plants. So as late as 2009, this organization was taking money from Union Gas and Enbridge Gas. And there's a bit of a conflict of interest here for a Clean Air Alliance swapping out coal for gas, right?
My first encounter with them was their anti-nuclearism as well, and I thought it was a joke organization. It's a Clean Air Alliance trying to shut down nuclear?
They were very upset that Ontario's coal generation was replaced by nuclear, which produces absolutely zero air pollution, rather than gas. And there's actually a really interesting anecdote, again, happened around 2009. You probably remember this gas plant controversy where the Liberal government at the time was building gas plants in a number of suburban neighborhoods and politically important suburban neighborhoods. And so, halfway through constructing a gas plant, they decided for electoral reasons to cancel the project. And so hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars were lost in that fiasco. And indeed, I think one of the premier's advisors spent 35 days in jail, and it may be why Dalton McGuinty was, left as the leader of the Liberal Party. But in any case, at that time, there was a group in, I believe it was in Oakville, who were protesting the construction of one of these gas plants about 500 meters from their housing. And the chairman of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, Mr. Jack Gibbons, went to one of their organizing meetings and poo-pooed them. I say he gaslit them because he told them, hey, you know what? The smokestacks are really tall, and it's very important that we build our energy infrastructure near where the demand is. Okay, so it has to be in your backyard. Don't worry. I'm with the Clean Air Alliance. These smokestacks will keep the smog out of your neighborhood. And so the hypocrisy of that position, both in terms of the obvious problems with being a Clean Air Alliance and advocating for smog-producing natural gas, but also in terms of this idea that we need to build our energy infrastructure near where we consume it because that's environmentally friendly. We don't need to build thousands of kilometers of transmission lines. Now their position has completely flipped. They want to build those transmission lines, bring power in from Quebec, rather than it going to replacing coal and gas in upstate New York. So it's a very bizarre organization, and really they're the Ontario Anti-Nuclear Alliance. They really exist for that purpose. But interestingly, in the last year or so, they've I think tried to build off that legacy of the coal phase out by calling for a gas phase out, which is a very interesting campaign. And again, they're very masterful in terms of political organizing. They've been to a whole number of municipalities around the province. They've got motions put forward at these municipal government hearings, and it's actually forced our independent electricity systems operator to model and consider, well, can we do a gas phase out? What would it look like? And the really funny thing is that the Ontario Clean Air Alliance have been just constant critics and fearmongers around Pickering, and have been fighting to get it shut down, over and over throughout the years. And when it shuts down, again, we're going to be burning gas to replace its output. 10 million tons of CO2 as a result. So this is a highly contradictory organization, and one that's, I think, really morally bankrupt. And given its track record, taking money from the fossil fuel industry, gaslighting residents concerned about air quality, saying that you need to have a gas plant in your backyard, and fighting tooth and nail to shut down Ontario's nuclear fleet, which again produces zero particulate air, any air pollution at all. It's a morally bankrupt position. It's a hypocritical position.
You get a lot of these organizations that people, they name them opposite of what they are, to try to fool people.
Yeah,
and I thought that's what this was, and maybe it really is.
It's good clickbait, I think, right? I think the thing that I've learned most, though, from going from being a pro-nuclear advocate in general to like an actual campaign with real-world impacts, such as losing Pickering, such as taxing the gas, is it's made everything much more concrete for me, and it's really pointed again to the challenge and the monumental scale of this energy transition that we're supposedly embarking on. The kind of political will, the marshalling of resources, if we really want to do this, even in a rich country or rich province like Ontario that's already miles ahead, it's enormous. So what drives me crazy is when you have people from the environmental movement who say it's going to be easy. We just need the political will. We just need to build enough wind turbines and solar panels. We have all the technology that we need. This campaign in particular has shown me just how crazy that all is. Because, in addition to saving the climate, we need to keep our ventilators running in our hospitals and our water treatment plants running, and all of the sort of basic needs of a society, which rely on, abundant, affordable energy.
Stable baseload.
Yeah. And nuclear does give us that way out of this, what's been called the Gordian knot.
Mm-hmm. So you've been helping to organize a Stand Up for Nuclear event, I believe, putting your money where your mouth is, I guess. Can you tell everybody a little bit about this upcoming event?
Yes, it's I guess a little bit of money, but mostly sweat and tears. Last year I did pay for a few banners out of my pocket, and I spent a day painting signs with my family. But so this is a global event. Their events, I've lost track now of how many cities are involved. Last year it was over 50. I think this year it's over 80. And basically, the environmental case for nuclear energy is, it being framed in that light probably goes as far back as the 70s when the renowned tinkerer, scientist, inventor James Lovelock started talking positively about nuclear energy and its role in fighting climate change and in the environment. This is, again, the gentleman who came up with the Gaia hypothesis. The Earth is a kind of a living organism existing in a homeostasis between all of its elements. And, we've had a number of heterodox environmental thinkers throughout the years. Mark Linus would be an example, and others who have come up and created a space where we can start understanding and talking about the environmental case for nuclear energy. But up until recently, we haven't seen advocacy movements or grassroots organizing around it. And believe you me, I have a history in some labor organizing, fighting for refugee healthcare, working on issues of Indigenous health, migrant health. I've always been on the politics side of things. I've never really been thinking about technology. And so the fact that I've become an activist who is so focused on a technology is a very strange thing for me. But that is the strangeness of our times. We're dealing with climate change and this question of energy transition. And so it becomes a very important thing to interrogate and understand the benefits and drawbacks of the tools at our disposal. And we need to choose the right ones. So in any case, a movement is now growing, a grassroots movement of folks all around the world who are gathering in public to engage with the public, to get to know each other, to get off of the kind of internet echo chambers, and to really try and start having a political impact and change minds. Because boy, do we have a long hill to get up. There's a lot of preconceptions and myths. I think there's probably no field that's, where there's more misconceptions and misunderstandings than that of nuclear energy. So it's, a Sisyphean task, pushing the boulder up the hill. But the stand-up events have been really crucial, I think, to catalyzing this international movement. And so in 2019, we had a single event in Toronto. In 2020, we had an event in Victoria, BC, of all places. It was a surprise to me, but Edmonton and Toronto. And this year we're having even more events in 8 cities across the country. So, if you are a listener and you're in, basically get in touch with Al, get on the Rational View Facebook page, and you can find out how to participate in these events. But a great place to come out, even if you don't have your mind made up about nuclear, you're going to meet some people, you get to chat with them, pose your questions. So it's a really great opportunity to engage with people and for me, to figure out my messaging and figure out what people's concerns on, because I think there can be a tendency to start to get a bit jaded and burned out and dismissive and angry even, especially with these rearguard battles I've been describing. But, always sort of understanding where people are coming from, being compassionate, empathetic, trying to get in their shoes and understand their concerns. That's how you eventually going to change minds, right? And it's through these personal relationships, seeing people face to face, I find that I've had the greatest success, and I've changed some pretty interesting people's minds on nuclear. So it's a chance to both go to try and do that and to have your mind changed as well. So a very interesting environment. So highly recommend that people check out Stand Up for Nuclear, both if you're in Canada and it's around the world, wherever you are. I know you have a big international audience, Al, so maybe we'll post that in the show notes.
Indeed. So, is there anything else you wanna hit on your Tax the Gas campaign? Links you want to put out there?
Easy URL to remember, just taxthegas.org. Climate is an international issue, so we do have a petition there. It's open for anybody to sign. There is an option to click and get added to our mailing list, which would be wonderful, because we're trying to build a movement here, and that's the 21st century way to do it. So yeah, taxthegas.org, sign the petition, and you'll see a link there to Canadians for Nuclear Energy if you want to learn more about the kind of parent organization of this campaign.
Thank you so much for coming on to the program again. I love chatting with you, and I hope everyone enjoyed listening to this. It's great to have you on. Thank you.
It's a pleasure being back, Al.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.